Hey everyone, this is section 4 of chapter 4 of Lucien Laurat's Marxism and Democracy. The section's called The First Stage of the Socialist Revolution. The economic and social development which has taken place during the past 20 or 30 years permits us to see things more clearly today. The situation has sufficiently crystallized to permit us to develop quite considerably the ideas of Marx on the proletarian revolution, its forms and its order. We must excuse ourselves for using a banal image, but at least it has the great advantage of illustrating exactly what we mean. The end of capitalist development, which appeared to Marx and Engels like a far-away point on the horizon, seems to us, their followers, to be a vast landscape in which we live and move and have our being. The transformation of the economic system and of society as a whole towards socialism has begun. Many observers, both socialists and anti-socialists, refuse to accept the evidence before their eyes because, first of all, they have never understood the Marxist theory of capitalist development. Secondly, because the transformation has taken on hideous forms in Russia, Italy, and Germany and inspires them with horror. And finally, because they are prisoners of the utopian and primitive ideas of social revolution held by the adolescent working class movement a century ago, and still expect that the social revolution will come about in the form of a violent explosion and in a very short space of time. However, viewed historically, such an explosion may extend over several generations. Since the World War, we have experienced only the first convulsions of this transformation. The great problem which faces the organizations of the working class in our epoch, is precisely to act in such a way that the necessary and inevitable evolution may come about with a minimum of destruction, and open the safety valves in good time, so as to reduce social tension to such a degree that, quote, revolutionary evolution, the term is Emil van der Velde's, can take the place of a succession of violent explosions. Will socialism and trade unionism succeed in performing this task? We are convinced that it is possible, and we shall presently show why. In looking at the world in which we live, we are staggered at the almost mathematical precision with which the essential predictions of Karl Marx are being realized. Traditional capitalism is dying. Traditional capitalism's dying agonies are setting greater and greater masses of people in movement, and our epoch is marked by anti-capitalist movements and uprisings. Even most of the fascist movements call themselves socialist, and this is not merely because hypocrisy is the homage paid by vice to virtue, but because, and above all, the utopian socialism which characterizes many fascist programs is the natural expression of unenlightened masses in revolt. We shall not stress any further here the economic development of our day is tending toward more and more collectivist forms, because we have already dealt with this point sufficiently in the earlier parts of this chapter. As Marx and Engels foresaw, the privileged classes are stopping at nothing to stave off the day of their defeat. They recoil from no violence, however brutal, and recently we have seen in the affair of the Cagulars that even poison appears to them as an acceptable weapon in their struggle. In spite of the hatred they profess for Marxism, In spite of the hatred they profess for Marxism, the governments which have been carried to power by the movement of unenlightened masses established forms and institutions which might be called socialist if the masses of the people enjoyed liberty, an indispensable condition of socialism as we conceive it. Footnote. This hatred is clearly proclaimed by fascism and admitted by implication in Russia, where Stalin and his clique persecute Marxist thought in all its forms and brutally liquidate its advocates. End footnote. In democratic countries, where there has been no violent revolution, we can observe the same development towards a more and more collectivist economic structure. Socialism in power, whether alone or in collaboration with other parties, strives to control the rhythm of that development and prevent its plunging the world into chaos. Footnote. Let us seize the opportunity of dealing once and for all with certain sophisms dear to the heart of Dimitrov. According to Dimitrov, it was socialist participation in the government in Germany and Austria which paved the way for fascism. Those who use this argument ought at least to know that Austrian social democracy took no part in the government after 1920. We might reply, revealing in particular to the example of Austria and to the more recent example of Spain, that it is rather non-participation which paves the way for fascism, although we must admit frankly that social democratic methods suffered a defeat in Germany and Austria. Although, of course, the tactics adopted were different in the two countries, it remains nevertheless true that in all other countries, Scandinavia, Czechoslovakia, Belgium, and France, democratic socialism can boast of having powerfully served the cause of socialist emancipation. These methods have proved themselves satisfactory throughout the world, with the one exception of Germany, and it is a crass piece of intellectual dishonesty to draw general conclusions from one German tragedy in defiance of all that has happened in the rest of the world. End footnote. We're now right in the middle of the most tremendous revolution the world has ever known, and only those who understand the word, quote, revolution in the way the police do need wonder that the upheaval which haunts their dreams has taken such a long time in coming. Footnote. See the passage dealing with the polemic of Kautsky against Bernstein quoted in Chapter 2 of this book. End footnote. The socialism of our day must divest its conception of the social revolution of the last vestiges of utopian socialist ideas, because utopian socialism, although colored with certain pseudo-Marxist notions, imagines that the capitalist world is advancing towards a day X and an hour Y, in which the proletariat will arise in its might, deal its enemies one crushing blow, establish its dictatorship, and build up an ideal socialist society in a very short space of time. Scientific socialism, on the other hand, has steadfastly refused to give any detailed description a priori of socialist society. This apocalyptic scheme proceeds from a distorted generalization of the experiences of 1798 and the 1848 revolutions. Sorry, what did I say? It says 1798, but I think it's 1789 is what's supposed to be referred to there. 1789, 1848 revolutions. And in the bargain, these events have been transferred, once again in a distorted fashion, from the political to the economic field. Economically, this utopian idea of the proletarian revolution corresponds to a stage of capitalism not yet ripe for socialization, and one at which socialists necessarily harbored fantastic ideas about the form in which socialization would come about. We may apply what Marx and Engels said in the manifesto of the Communist Party about utopian socialism in general to this primitive conception of socialization, expressed today in the well-known formula, quote, the expropriation of the expropriators, end quote. Quote, such fantastic pictures of future society, painted at a time when the proletariat is still a very undeveloped when the proletariat is still in a very undeveloped state, and has but a fantastic conception of the proletariat's own position, correspond with the first instinctive yearnings of that class for a general reconstruction of society, end quote. Marx and Engels' Manifesto of the Communist Party. It was because of this insufficient maturity that about half a century ago militant socialists felt a little uneasy when explaining to their new recruits the rudiments of the materialist conception of history. Quote, no social order ever disappears before all the productive forces for which there is room in that social order have been developed, and new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have been matured in the womb of the old society, end quote. Marx, a contribution to the critique of political economy. However, if the political and legal superstructure of society is, in the last analysis, the expression of its economic basis, that is to say, of its productive relations, any revolution can consist only in the adaptation of the political and legal system to economic changes which have already taken place. This was, of course, the case in all bourgeois revolutions, which did no more than fashion the political state in the image of capitalist economy, slowly come to maturity within the framework of the old society. The conditions for the socialist revolution, on the other hand, seem to those far-off days to be totally different. Whilst the bourgeoisie had been able to develop its own property and productive relations within the framework of the old regime until, When they became mature, they burst the old shell asunder. There seemed no way in which the proletariat could develop collective property to any extent within the framework of capitalist society. Directly contrary to the bourgeois revolution, it seemed that the socialist revolution would have to begin its task by changing the superstructure first, then the base, and that it would apparently be able to tackle the base only afterwards. Historical materialism, which insisted that a change in the base must proceed and bring in its train the change in the superstructure, seemed inadequate, and hence the secret uneasiness of the militant socialists of that time. In our own day, there is no cause for any such uneasiness. Collectivist economic forms are already in existence, and, as we have seen, collectivist economic forms are rapidly increasing in number. In the course of its development, capitalism has taken the general lines foreseen by Marx. Within its own framework, it has produced the, quote, material conditions, end quote, for the existence of these new productive relations. According to Zombart, in 1919, joint stock companies in the United States represented 31.6% of all undertakings. This 31.6% employed 86.6% of the total number of wage earners, and their share in the total value of production as a whole amounted to 87.7%. The working capitalist, owning and directing his own enterprise, has disappeared from all vital branches of the modern economic system. The working capitalist has been driven back into the more barren fields of production, where the struggle for life is becoming increasingly bitter. It is really the capitalist Marx had in mind in his celebrated chapter on the historical tendency of capitalist accumulation when Marx speaks of the, quote, expropriation of the expropriators. Is this really the capitalist Marx had in mind in his celebrated chapter on the historical tendency of capitalist accumulation when he speaks of, quote, the expropriation of the expropriators, end quote? We may be permitted to doubt it if we refer to Volume 3, Chapter 27, from which we have already quoted considerable extracts. The joint stock company, considered by Marx as, quote, a necessary transitional point, end quote, is no longer an isolated and sporadic phenomenon today, and in fact, is the predominant element in a large sector of the modern economic system. The, quote, material conditions for the existence of new productive relations already exist. Contrary to what militant socialists thought rather uneasily about 50 years ago, historical materialism is seen to emerge unscathed from the ordeal of the intervening period. The socialist revolution will not have to create a socialist economic system out of nothing. Like the example of the bourgeois revolution, the rise of the proletariat to power will be the culmination of a state of things already existing in economic life. The adaptation of the political superstructure to an economic basis already socialized within the framework of capitalism. Like the example of the bourgeois revolution, the rise of the proletariat to power will be the culmination of the state of things already existing in economic life, the adaptation of the political superstructure to an economic basis already socialized within the framework of capitalism. Footnote. Quote, socialized in the sense in which Marx understood this term when Marx spoke of the process of centralization and concentration operating in capitalism and under capitalist impulse. End footnote. Even today, many socialists imagine that the only socialization worthy of the name, and the only one to which the working class can set its hands without dirtying them, is expropriation without compensation. We have already seen at the opening of this book that neither Marx nor Engels ever expressed such an opinion, and the development of capitalism since their death has done nothing to lend any weight to it. On the contrary, it has rendered it completely absurd. To realize this clearly, we have but to glance at things as they really are. Let us suppose that socialism is in power alone and strong enough to undertake fundamental measures. The most important and centralized branches of the economic system, the credit apparatus and the key industries, precisely those which lend themselves most readily to socialization, are almost completely controlled by joint stock companies, and the scattering of smaller enterprises still individually controlled hardly count. Who is to be expropriated without compensation? The masses of shareholders? But the great majority of these shareholders are not capitalists. The money they have invested in shares represents no more than an insurance premium for them, and they are threatened with expropriation not by socialism, but by the finance plutocracy. We're here face to face with property already socialized, although, as Marx said, quote, in a negative fashion, end quote. In a negative fashion, that is to say, a handful of administrators is, quote, the possibility of disposing of social capital not its own, end quote. In short, to dispose just as it likes of other people's property. There is no point whatever in expropriating collective proprietors, the shareholders. The point is to dispossess the plutocracy of its power to dispose of already collectivized property. As far as the joint stock companies are concerned, it is impossible to socialize their property for the simple reason that it already is socialized. All that remains to be done there is to socialize power, or to use another word, authority. The expulsion of the monopolist and finance plutocracy from its dominant positions will be no more than the social recognition of an already existing state of affairs, that is, the existence of property already collectivized. As Marx and Engels predicted, the socialist transformation, like the bourgeois revolution, will come about as the adaptation of a superstructure to an already changed base. We cannot stress too vigorously that the last vestiges of utopian socialist ideas still current in certain socialist circles must be categorically rejected. In those branches of the economic system in which socialization is already possible, there are no capitalist employers to expropriate, and those branches in which they still exist are still far from being ripe for socialization. The economic task of socialism and trade unionism in this first stage of the proletarian revolution is to adapt the law to already collectivized economic forms, and to remove them from the power of the spoliatory and parasitic oligarchy which still controls them. The task is not to expropriate the shareholders, but to put the shareholders in a position to dispose freely and consciously of their collective property. Jesus Christ. Footnote. All this will obviously not be possible without a considerable extension of economic democracy. Its essential condition is the development of economic competence on the part of the masses of the people. End footnote. As far as the important branches of economic life are concerned, the credit system and key industries, the task is to replace the omnipotent control of the plutocratic oligarchy by organs of public control. And finally, our task is to establish the principle of economic control over the principle of competition, which is now becoming more and more chaotic and even paralyzing as the result of the gradual extinction of the automatic regulating mechanism of former times. We do not overlook the fact that the success of this task depends on an extension of collectivization by the extension of the public sector of the economic system. Footnote. We have no reason whatever today to give up the point of view we expressed in our booklet, Économie planée contre économie enchaînée, published in 1932. Events since then have confirmed it. End footnote. However, just as it is impossible to socialize everything from one day to the next, it is also impossible to pass with one step from the chaotic economic system of today to an integral economic system perfectly controlled. These two things complement each other. They are nothing but two aspects of one and the same development. The various labor plans drawn up in France, Belgium, Switzerland, Holland, and Czechoslovakia have laid down precisely how much was both possible and necessary in the given period. We could, of course, make reservations with regard to the terminology employed, and in particular with regard to the term, quote, structural reform. However, that is not the question. Whatever may be the terms employed, the fact is that working class organizations are in agreement concerning the essential objects they believe attainable in the course of the period now opening up. The French CGT speaks constantly of the necessity for, quote, structural reforms, unquote, whilst in the French Socialist Party the term is seldom heard. However, the principal points of the CGT plan and the aims formulated by the Socialist Party Congress of Toulouse in 1934 and Mulhouse, I don't know if it's French or not. Wait, no, it's French. However, let me repeat that sentence then. However, the principal points of the CGT plan and the aims formulated by the Socialist Party Congresses of Toulouse, 1934, and Mulhouse, 1935, and confirmed by the Marseille Socialist Congress in 1937, are more or less identical. In our opinion, things are more important than words. We're quite prepared to admit that we feel very little desire to engage in arguments about the difference between the socialization possible, quote, within the framework of capitalism, end quote, and that which goes beyond it. Here we are once again faced with survivals of utopian socialism, whose fantastic schemes were destined to be brought about at one blow, and imply the idea of a clear and precise dividing line between the capitalist system and socialism. A dividing line certainly does exist, but it cannot be represented by a day X and an hour Y. On the contrary, it may extend over several generations. Footnote: in a lecture delivered at École Supérieure Socialiste on the 16th of November 1937, summing up the experiences of 1936, Leon Blum pointed out that the limits of the, quote, framework of capitalism, end quote, far from being as rigid as was thought at one time, were in reality elastic. Blum agrees with us that there are no clear defined limits between the two systems, but a wide zone of transition. Writing in his recent book, Socialisten und Krieg, is that socialization and Krieg and war? I'm not sure what that means. Kautsky declares, quote, socialism is not a ready-made social structure, but a specific tendency of social development influenced by the proletariat. There's the word influence there. Socialism needs, the proletariat's needs, the proletariat's power, the proletariat's means. In given relations of social forces, those institutions, which lend themselves more readily to the influence of this development, may be socialized more speedily than others, end quote. Kautsky, end footnote. Throughout the whole world today, quote, the framework of capitalism is crumbling. New forms are rising and developing within it, undermining it, weakening it, and emptying it of its substance. It would be a bold man who, watch in hand, would undertake to proclaim the precise moment at which the past gives place to the future. What separates the past from the future is not a second or an hour, but that whole period we call the present. Certainly, whilst capitalism was still powerful, unshaken and unshakable, it had to be admitted that any measures of socialization carried out within its still intact framework were of very relative value only. Today, however, with the framework of capitalism cracking at every joint, the criterion is elsewhere. The criterion lies in democracy. The forms of socialization which have been carried out in Russia and Italy, and the collective forms which are developing in a hothouse atmosphere in Germany, would certainly be of value from the socialist standpoint if the community as a whole were permitted to decide freely on the use to which these instruments of economic control should be put. All economic history presents itself to the careful observer as a succession of mixed economic forms, that is to say, of different systems overlapping and interpenetrating. To take only the evolution of the past 2 or 3 centuries, we see that during the long period which preceded the bourgeois revolution, industrial capitalism, at first embryonic only, developed within the framework of the old regime before overcoming it. Under modern capitalism, which has become the dominant economic form, we can still observe numerous pre-capitalist and even feudal economic survivals, and for a long while during the 19th century, capitalism, already triumphant, accommodated even slavery within its orbit. Side by side with these survivals, we can observe the development, still within the framework of capitalism, of more and more numerous and more important embryonic socialist forms. Thus we observe the interpenetration and coexistence of different economic forms. Although as a general rule, one specific form is the dominant system and stamps its seal on all the others coexisting with it, whether vestiges of the past or embryos of the future. We therefore find it difficult to understand the attacks launched against Charles Spinasse by socialists believing themselves to have a monopoly of the revolutionary spirit. On the 12th of March 1937, Spinasse, then Minister of National Economy, declared in the French Chamber of Deputies, quote, Do you imagine, gentlemen, that I'm going to smash up the capitalist system before I am in a position to replace the capitalist system? Nothing of the sort. I know that the capitalist system is quite capable of lasting a long time yet, end quote. Charles Spinoza. We agree entirely with Spinoza that it would be senseless to smash the capitalist system without being in a position to replace it. We know also that the task of replacing the capitalist system would be a long and arduous one, and as far as concerns his other statements about the length of time capitalism is still capable of lasting, only those need be perturbed who believe in the possibility of establishing socialism as, quote, integral, as indefinite, from one day to the next. However, if we believe that the advance towards socialism implies socialization by stages, then the idea of leaving capitalist property intact in those sectors of the economic system not yet ripe for socialization is a logical development. In those sectors, capitalism certainly still has a long time to go. The great thing in these conditions is to know whether it can still be defined as capitalism in the traditional sense of the term, and to what extent the economic system in which we are living today still merits the term, quote, capitalist. In a speech delivered at St. Leonard's in May 1937, Leon Blum quoted some interesting passages written by Pessamane just after the World War. Quote, "The capitalist system has very deep roots, and we shall not be able to pull them up with one tug. And I say this is a good thing. I fear a too rapid collapse of the bourgeoisie, as I have often said to my comrades. Yes, of course, I can see that everything is in a state of decomposition, ... But when I, who have so often proclaimed that it is the task of the working class to take over the succession from the bourgeoisie, look around, I can't help being afraid that the succession may come too soon, before the working class is ready to accept it," end quote. Pessamane, quoted by Leon Blum in May 1937. Leon Blum commented as follows, quote, "The italics are ours." Quote, "In fact, my dear comrades, the revolution you have in mind has already begun. Though the revolution you have in mind will not be accomplished within the space of a few weeks, and if you ask my opinion, it will take years and years. You surely don't imagine that the new social order will take the place of the old as if by magic, or that a new regime will suddenly arise in the place of the old. The truth is that parallel with the decomposition of bourgeois and capitalist society, we can see all around us the strength of the working class is gradually taking shape. The truth is that parallel with the decomposition of bourgeois and capitalist society, we can see all around us the strength of the working class is gradually taking shape. Capitalism will not suddenly disappear, and certainly not in the countries of Western Europe. When you realize that he, bracket, Pessamane, and bracket, spoke like that 17 years ago, you'll imagine how glad he would be if he could share our present experience, end quote. Leon Blum. I'm assuming this is from the same speech at St. Leonard's in May 1937. We have no hesitation in endorsing these sentiments of Leon Blum. Yes, the revolution has already begun. Nothing is more ridiculous or more anti-Marxist than to think it could be, quote, made. Revolutions make themselves. They have no need of any schoolmasters to assist them. All that is necessary is that the organizations of the working class should adopt tactics calculated to promote this gigantic economic and social transformation, and to prevent the heritage they must take up from foundering and being destroyed in the chaos of civil and national wars. That's the end of the section. Thank you so much for listening. The next section, if you're listening to all these, is titled The Conditions of Revolutionary Evolution. Thanks for listening.